You know, imagine a society, going back to King, where there is a widespread belief that it's okay for one group to have certain advantages that are not shared by another group. You know, to raise the possibility that that might not be okay is not simply to point out what we all believe. People were living with that inequality. They certainly believed it was okay. Some people would fight to preserve it. But raising the possibility that it could be different shakes this idea that it is part of the natural law, that things have to be this way. And then some of the people who think it is okay, by seeing that it doesn't have to be this way, can start to entertain the possibility of something else. And of course, our own society is full of all kinds of inequalities. I mean, to take an extremely controversial example, just take the simple fact of inequality of wealth. You know, you can imagine, and this was the central focus of some forms of socialist societies, communist societies, is that that's a kind of inequality that we should not tolerate. And revolutions, whole changes of life were developed as a result of leaders saying that this thing we've just accepted as a given, as not only permissible, but inevitable. People were so captivated by that idea that there were major social experiments in trying to change it. So I think leaders are able to shift values by showing us possibilities. The possibilities change our conception of what's necessary, and that leads to an opening for a new moral perspective.
Do you think leaders can be virtuous, or that they should aspire to be virtuous?
Virtue, I think, is something that is observer relative, which is to say traits we find virtuous might not be traits others find virtuous. A kind of zealous adherence to a set of, say, religious norms might be viewed as virtuous in one society, but in our secular society that might be seen as a failing, a moral failing. So whether or not a leader can be virtuous is really a question of whether or not we perceive our leaders in a certain way. Virtue presupposes something else, which is a kind of durability of trait. And I think there is a presupposition when one talks about virtue that people have character traits that are, in some sense, internally generated or internally maintained. So circumstance should not have the ability to override a tendency to act in accordance with those internal traits. There are people in philosophy who are claiming that social science, social psychology in particular, cast doubt on that very psychological construct, which is to say people are so susceptible to influence of circumstance that it's really external variables that drives behavior, not internal workings. I actually think that those two propositions, that circumstance drives behavior and that there can be virtuous leaders, are not incompatible as they might initially appear. The reason for that is simple, and it's that leadership is itself a kind of circumstance. So ironically, I actually think that the role that a leader plays is in some respects more conducive to the development of stable traits of character, including ones we regard as virtuous, than many other roles. If it becomes kind of our paradigm of leadership, our ideal, something we look for in leaders, that they have stable traits, then simply adopting that position might lead to more consistency of character, more moral fortitude than we might see in the general population. So the rosy view is that leadership is actually one place where we might be more likely to see virtue emerge than in other walks of life. Other examples might be somebody who's a fireman or fire person taking on a job where the expectations involve a certain consistency of character that we would praise.
How do you explain obligations to people in other cultures then? So for example, do we have obligations to people in Haiti? We're not in the same lifeboat they're in. Is there some explanation for?
I would be depressed myself to live in a world where people sent those Oxfam checks out of obligation. I mean, I think there's a sense in which we recognize suffering, and many of us care a great deal about the suffering of others, and it doesn't need to be a moral command that we do something about it, We have a concern that drives us to act. Now, when somebody says, you have a moral obligation to send that check to Oxfam, I actually think that most of us, where the us here refers to something like contemporary middle-class American culture, most of us would reject that. They would not say, I did this because I was obligated to. And if somebody felt that way, we'd feel like it wasn't a genuine or sufficiently honorable motivation. They felt under pressure, not under concern. Would all humanity go out of the way for people who are not members of the same cultural group? I think we've seen evidence that that isn't the case, that proximity affects how much concern we show. The fact that Haiti was south of our border made a big difference. The fact that Katrina happened here made a big difference. The tsunami in the Indian Ocean killed twice as many people as Haiti, and I don't know what the numbers are. There certainly was quite a bit of generosity here, but my guess is that in the end we'll do a lot more for Haiti than we did for the countries affected by that catastrophe. And the very fact in the case of Katrina that the catastrophe occurred is evidence for a deficiency of concern, since that to a certain degree was a preventable disaster. And the standard explanation for that lack, that failing, had to do with something like an in-group, out-group effect, that the people who are most vulnerable were not members of the policy-making segment of society. So I think that the extent to which we're showing concern for people in Haiti, while a marvelous expression of the human capacity to show concern, is not evidence for a more general tendency to do so in all circumstances.
You said that morality is culturally relative. On that view, can there be a conception of the common good that transcends culture?
Well, there can be an aspirational conception. I think there's a sense in which, as people who are stuck in the same situation, facing the complexities of life and having to get along with each other, we are in a position to work towards finding common ground. If you find yourself on a lifeboat with a group of people who have succumbed to an accident with the cruiser, you will find ways to agree and get along, and a division of labor that maximizes the prospects of a good outcome for everyone. I think in a global community, we do find ourselves willing to negotiate and make compromises with others, and that very often requires that we search out something like common ground. Now, does that mean there is, in fact, already prior to that endeavor, a common good that can be identified? Is there something out there which is our shared morality, a kind of overlap within all moral systems that we can identify and use to construct a global morality? I think there's no reason to believe that that's the case antecedently. I think between any two groups, you're likely to find some common ground. If you ask, is there a shared essence to morality, maybe an essence we have in virtue of our biology that you find in every group, then the answer is no. The common ground between two groups may be different than the common ground between two others. And for that reason, I think relativism doesn't entail, but it alerts us to the possibility that universal moral norms may not be present, may need to be built up.